So we'll jump straight into a demo, right? So in this demo, we're going to create a label, which is a sensitivity label. We're going to do the manual way first, and then I'll show you the option using an automatic method, right? We'll publish a label as well as just test and validate. Just note that when you publish a label, it takes really 24 hours. So it has been configured before, but I'll show you the process. So on my screen here. So I'm on the purview.microsoft.com portal, right? You can get here from your admin center. And we want to go to solutions. So in solutions, you'll see all the available solutions that Microsoft Purview offers. For this demonstration, we just want to focus on information protection. Right, so once it loads, you would see the different options you could do. You could look at your reports, your recommendations, and even your sensitivity labels. And we'll get to policies as well. So under sensitivity labels, you'll view the current labels that you have, similar to what we've seen in the presentation, public, general, and confidential. So to create a label, click create a label, and we're going to give it a name. So we're going to name this highly confidential, right? The same can be done for the display name. And we want to give a description so the end users can see what this label actually does. You could also put a description for admins if needed. You also have the option to put a label color, right? Because this is highly confidential, I'll go with red and click next. Here you can define the scope for your labels. So you have files, so Microsoft 365 apps, you have Microsoft Fabric, which includes Power BI, emails, meetings, and groups on sites with SharePoint. So I'm fine with this, click next. Here you can see the protection settings that will enforce encryption for the different labels. So because this is highly confidential, I want to have control access as well as apply content marking. In the access control section, just go through it briefly. You can see assign permissions now or let users decide. Best practice, I'll prefer to assign permissions now, and as well as user access content expires. So you could say it could set a specific date or give some numbers. So for this example, I'm fine with putting 30 days, right? And allow offline access. So I'm fine with putting 30 days as well. Under assign permission to specific users and groups, this is where you'd have your granular control. So you could assign it to everyone in the organization. If you click on that, it will automatically add the domain here. You could do authenticated users, like your guest users, and hover over the eye if you need some more information. For this example, I want to do some users and groups. So I'm fine with adding a few users here in the list. So we have Stacy, we have Becky, and we have Keisha. So click add. So you see the users listed here. Click save. Scroll down a little bit as well. You would see dynamic watermarking. What this does is it will automatically assign a watermark with the user ID, and you could put highly confidential as well. And you could customize the text if needed. For double key encryption, as the name suggests, it requires two keys, one from Microsoft and one from yourself. Note that once you encrypt it with double key encryption, if you're using stuff like Copilot, you won't be able to read the file. All right, so once I'm satisfied with this, I could click next. Here's where you could do content marking as well. So similarly to what we did with the dynamic watermarking, you actually have a watermark at the top, a header or footer. So you could just say important. Put that in red. Click next. So you can do auto labeling here, but I'm not going to, because I'll show you how you could do it on the outside, from the beginning. For defined protection settings, you have the option to do privacy and external user access. If you have conditional access policies within the environment, let's say you only want managed devices to access the SharePoint site, you can configure that as well within this wizard here. So for this example, I'm going to do privacy and external user access. See what that looks like. Under privacy, you see you have the option for public, private, and none. So only team owners and members can access this group or team, and only owners can add members. So if it's highly confidential, I could set to none, and I'm not going to let external user access because this is critical data. Once I'm finished, I could review my permissions and my configuration, click create label. So it's submitting and checking to make sure everything is okay, right? So you have the option to publish a label now, or you could wait, right? So don't create a policy. So I'm not going to create a policy as yet. I'll show you what that looks like as well. So once your label is created, I'll show you an option of how you could do an automatic label. So the first step that I did there was a manual label process. To do a auto labeling policy, you first click the label that you want to be as a auto labeling. You create the highly confidential, you create the auto labeling policy button, and it will generate the name for you. So this name is fine for this demo. It's going to validate the name, right? So this is fine. I don't need to change the name or what label is assigned to it. Click next. Admin unit is similar to an OU. So this is going to affect the full directory. So I'm fine with that. And here's where you could see where the auto label could be applied. So it could be applied to Exchange, email, SharePoint sites, and OneDrive accounts. This example, I'm going to do a SharePoint site. And you could also edit. So if I wanted to be assigned to a specific SharePoint site, you could add the URL or look for it here. So I want to assign it to my finance team. Click done. I'm fine. Click next. Here's where you could set some rules for the auto labeling. This example, I'm just going to do some advanced rules because you could see the difference between common rules and advanced. So common rules is to define one set of rules that will apply to all locations. And advanced rules is to define different rules for each location. So click next. I'm going to create a new rule. Name this rule 1. And here's where you could apply conditions. So for example, you could say that this content is a sensitive info type or changeable classifier. You could do the content is shared with people outside my organization. And you could do maybe the file extension. So because SharePoint supports Word, Excel, PowerPoint, and PDF, you could add the extension file here. It's going to automatically label these documents within the SharePoint site. You could also add exceptions. So if I wanted to add an exception for a particular file, or if it's created by a certain individual, you could add that here. Click save. It's going to validate the rule to ensure that it's correct. Right, once I'm satisfied with what is configured, I click next. And you could run the policy in simulation mode. Now, I would recommend that you do this first to test because this is going to automatically assign a label. You don't want to disrupt your organization's policies and flows. So you could run it in policy mode or even leave it turned off and then test it on your own. Once you finish, you click next and submit. Create policy. All right, so what that looks like for the end user, I'm just going to pull up a virtual environment. We created a manual label. Actually, before I go to that, let me just do one more step here. Click on. So you created a manual label and we created an automatic label as well. To deploy the manual label, you go to label policies and you publish your label. So you go through the same process of the wizard, define the sensitivity label that you want to publish to end users. So we created highly confidential recently. Click add and click next. The OU or admin unit is the same, so I'll leave that as is. And you could assign it to individual users or the entire company. I'm fine with all users. And here's where you could have policy settings. So you could ensure that the users provide a justification to remove a label or lower its classification. You could require users to apply a label to their emails and documents, as well as their Fabric and Power BI content. And you could also provide them with a link if you have a SharePoint link with some HR policies or acceptable use policies. So you could click these two, click next. Here's where it will ask you, what is the default label? So for this example, because you are only publishing one label, it will only have this reference. So I'll leave it as is. Same thing goes for label emails. Same thing goes for meetings, calendar events. Right? Click next. Default label to SharePoint sites and groups. You can leave that as none. If you have Power BI or Fabric content within your environments, you could have a default label there as well. So once you finish, you'll name your policy and it will publish. Right? So I'm not going to do this because this has been created before. And as I mentioned earlier, it takes 24 hours to replicate for your end users. So go into a virtual machine. I just want to show you how it looks for the end user. So I have two documents here. One is called general label and the other confidential label. Right? So I have some paragraph here about the dog and the Neil and Stacy, which is the user I'm using here. You can see the sensitivity label appear in our Word document, and it will look the same across all the apps that you have the label applied. So do the drop down, you can see confidential and restricted. You won't see highly confidential because, as I mentioned, it wasn't published and it would take a while. So going through the different options, if I wanted to do restricted, you would see the dynamic watermarking that was done before. So you would see highly confidential, you would see her name and the organization domain. If I go back into the restricted, you can see view permissions. Here's where you would see some of the permissions. So if you wanted to do a step further that this document can be copied, printed, saved, or exported, these are set to no, and the user wouldn't be able to do that. So going back to this general, you'll see that the justification is required. So your organization requires justification to change this label. So the previous label no longer apply, click change. And you would see that in Purview, where you would see the user change the label. right? One of the other things I'll do is let's simulate a ChatGPT, right? So Stacey is using ChatGPT to get some information on this document to summarize to speed up our process, right? So just want to make sure that this is a general. So since this is general, you could see that I could paste the confidential information. Let's say tell me about this document. It'll give you a summary. I will get to DLP protection. So this document is labeled as confidential, right? So I have some fake information here and it's labeled confidential. I'm going to do the same thing here. As you can see, our unknown error. I will get to that later on in the presentation. Because this is labeled as confidential, you start with your building blocks, right? So you have to know your data and then assign the label and then go to DLP policies where you could actually have further control.